And so I will move on now to introduce our last speaker in this session before we come back to Kyle, as I said at the end, who is a colleague I've worked with extensively at the Science Museum, Selina Hurley, who's Curator of Medicine at the Science Museum, where she led on the Medicine and Treatments Gallery. Her work focuses on the intersection of health, disease, therapeutics and materia medica throughout the modern period. In 2019, she somehow found time to co-edit and contribute to not just one, but two books called The Medicine Cabinet, published by Carlton, and Medicine and Imperfect Science, published by Scala. She also sits on the advisory panel for Thalidomide Stories, an oral history of thalidomide survivors, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And during her 14-year career at the Science Museum, she's worked on meteorites, clocks, climate science, psychology, and almost everything in between. So it's a great pleasure to hand over now to Selina.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen and hope that this works, because I've had a few issues today. One moment, please. I've not had very good technological friends today. Okay. Oh, sorry. I did practice this earlier. Can you see my slides, or is it just the PowerPoint at the moment? If someone wouldn't mind.
At the moment, it's just the PowerPoint, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's okay. I'll see if I can. How about that now?
That looks perfect.
Fantastic. I'll just turn off the subtitles. One moment. Okay, so you might have guessed from that introduction that I am not an Egyptologist. I'm happiest sitting in the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries at a push. So my confessions are much like Helen's before me. But as one of the curators that looks after Sir Henry Wellcome's museum collection on loan to the Science Museum, my experience of curating medicine has undeniably been influenced by the social history and anthropological nature of that work. And like my predecessors, not many of us have had the expertise, or sometimes the time, to fully investigate the Egyptology collection in our care. So this presentation has been a real opportunity for me to do a bit of a deep dive into some of our unknowns. So in this paper, I'll be talking about how we came to look after these items, and including some of the people who found themselves tasked with a monumental project, the ways in which the Science Museum have used it in the past and today, and a call for help as we move towards digitising the collection. So as some of you may be aware, the Science Museum is home to one of the largest portions of Sir Henry Wellcome's collection, of around 130,000 items, although it does depend on how you count them. So, discussions around a collaboration between the Science Museum and Wellcome began as early as 1967, when Keeper of Chemistry Frank Greenaway, seen here setting up a display at the Science Museum, was invited to a symposium to discuss the future of the collections at Wellcome, both the museum and the library. Prior to this, relationships have been cordial, quite friendly. Science Museum had hosted a history of surgery exhibition in 1947. They'd been swapping of information, you know, the general, do you know what this is, kind of letter to each other. Greenaway himself had been involved in the history of medicine and had borrowed lantern slides for talks at the Hunterian. And this element of his career is often overlooked due to his contributions to the history of chemistry. There was a visit in 1971 between Frank Greenaway and then director Sir David Follett, with Peter Williams, then director of the Wellcome Trust, and Sir John Michaels, who was a Wellcome trustee. Here, Greenaway and Follett shared plans for the Science Museum's expansion, which would then later become the 4th and 5th floor. During that meeting, according to minutes found at the Wellcome Library, Greenaway added that the Science Museum had not been thought necessary to cater for the history of medicine in a national museum because of the Wellcome. It was thought, though, that a potential transfer would ensure that the collection would be exhibited, looked after, and available to the public and researchers alike. On the appointment of Margaret Weston, who was the first female director in 1973, an agreement in principle was there, but it would take an intervention of the High Court in March 1977 to iron out all the complex legal issues. And Frank Greenaway hoped that by showing the history of medicine in the same building as the history of physical science and engineering, the public would lead to be seeing medicine as something rational and accessible, and physical science and technology as having humane associations. So keep that quote in mind, because I have sometimes difficulty with seeing sometimes medicine as rational. So the Science Museum loan came towards the end from a series of transfers, many of which are represented over the last few days. But for all this to come into being, a new department at the Science Museum was created, first known as Department 3, the Wellcome Museum for the History of Medicine, led by Brian Bracegirdle. He took his post in 1977. The first objects were catalogued, some for the very first time, and arrived at the Science Museum stores at Hayes in the very first year. And before taking a quick look at that process, I kind of want to look at the first incarnation of that team. Staff were really drawn from a scientific or medical background. So Bracegirdle had previously worked at ICI in the dyestuffs division. He loved microscopy, but also taught biology at London College. Robert Anderson, who became assistant keeper, like Greenaway, was a historian of chemistry. David Wright had joined as a museum assistant and had moved over to medicine to work in this new department and later joined the National Railway Museum. Gillen Skinner, later Lawrence, arrived as assistant keeper in 1979, but was a qualified GP. Christopher Lawrence was the only academic in the team. He'd been seconded over from the Wellcome's academic unit, but he'd also been a GP as well. So I wanted to take a look at some of the job adverts to find out what type of people they were looking for to help catalogue this monumental collection. So there are museum assistants, so you can see hopefully clearly the job advert online, people who are asked to have O-levels in English, either a maths or science subject, and including a good standard of physical fitness. There was lots of carrying to be done. And many of these people actually learned museums as they went along. I learnt museums when I joined as well, so nothing much as clearly has changed. You can also see a curator advert as well, asking for a degree, and with museum work as potentially advantageous. There were cataloguers, all graduates, but from a range of backgrounds, including history, science, biology, but it was thought that actually their expertise was not the most important thing, that their background was much less important than the attitudes of the objects and the aims of cataloguing. So I just wanted to reflect on this at this moment, to think about where history of medicine was at the time, where studies of anthropology were at the time, where curators of medicine were at the time. Is it a specialism? There's many more things to think about in the history of museum and medical curation that I've only just begun to think about. So by 1979, this department, there was 38 people, with 22 directly involved in cataloguing. But naturally, for the anthropological collections and the Egyptology collections, much was relied on existing cataloguing, as we can see from some of the experience of the team. It's really clear sometimes that the descriptions are lifted directly from the flimsy cards, which you'll be familiar with, and some of the Wellcome documentation. Experts were used, but so far I've only found a sentence in a journal article to suggest this was so, and I haven't quite yet found out the process. So on screen now is the process that cataloguing went through. As you can see, it's quite complicated. There's quite a lot of people involved. Catalogues only come in around 0.5 or 6, which is quite interesting. So there was a lot of pre-work done to get items ready for them. And some of the documentation is fantastic because you can track objects from where they originally were at Wellcome, if they were on display, or where exactly they were at the Enfield store. One thing I wanted to highlight, though, is the decision of the category of object, A, B, or C. And some of you may be familiar with the A, B's, and C material, which I'll come to in a second. And it was allocated by the keeper, who in this case is Brian Bracegirdle. So he might have been the only person who saw the 1977 version of the Wellcome collection in its entirety. How that played out in reality, I just don't know. And I think an oral history from some of the museum's assistants in the future would be one way to get to that answer. So I thought I'd just show you some of our documentation that we have at the Science Museum. So we have what we call MDA cards, so they're the Museum Documentation Association type cards that you can see with the green outline. And this is where all the information was transferred to, so any existing number, a description by a cataloguer. You can also see some of the physical attributes as well. And these cards form the basis of any digital computerized records, originally Prime in 1984 before being transferred to MIMSI, which is what we use now. There was also photographic records, so you can see 4 very lovely dispensing pots at the bottom there, and some cards as well, which sort of look like flimsies, but also not at the same time. So we're aware that some of the Science Museum cataloguers did add their own cards to fill in gaps in the sequence. For many, for the first time, these objects had never been catalogued. So if you ever see a Science Museum number above A600,000, it's likely it was first identified by Science Museum staff. Ever so occasionally, though, there are other Wellcome numbers which can help link it back. So sometimes we have a problem where we have a number, but we have no way of tracking it back to where it once might have been. It was decided that all A medicine material, which was identified using a necessarily broad definition of medicine, plus certain non-medical items suitable for background display, would go to the Science Museum. I have an unanswered question about what that broad definition of medicine was, particularly when you start looking at the Egyptology collections cared for by the Science Museum, and I will show you some in a second, I promise. As Kenny mentioned yesterday, we hold around 900 items designated as Egyptian, 360 from Sudan, and that includes 11 items excavated by Jebel Moya. So here on screen now, you can see some of the things we care for. These are amulets from the Winifred Blackburn collection, and you can see some of the numbering systems at work here. For quite small items, they have been numbered quite extensively. We also have beads, plaster casts, bottles, combs, tweezers, grooming tools, coal sticks, hand tools, grave goods, mummified human and animal remains, ladles, jugs, statuettes, deities, votive figures, mosaic glass, and of course, the large plaster casts of birth chambers. For me, it's been really reassuring to know that people have items that have either been physically split or collections that have split as well. Because while looking at this, I wasn't sure if I was the only one. So I feel much reassured to be within very good company. The provenance of what we currently know about these items reads like a who's who of collecting in this area. There's the auction houses, Sotheby's, Christie's. There are the collectors who then buy at those auctions, like the McGregor auction, who then only deal with Wellcome under pseudonyms like Epworth. There's also some items from some of the major secondary collections, such as the McGregor collection. There's a few Gay Anderson pieces in there. I found one piece of the Amherst collection, and so on. And of course, the Egyptology collections represent so many of Wellcome's collecting practices. Copies, casts, agents, a familiar story to quite a lot of us. But it was not just the newly created Department 3 who took items. Other Science Museum departments took things too. And this is the B material. So this is determined as scientific material. But looking at this slide, you might question that as a categorization. The B and C material were first offered to the Science Museum and then other institutions. This is an arrangement, if you look at some of the correspondence, that caused some consternation with other museums who were also collecting. Some of the materials here on screen was loaned, others was gifted, and why certain distinctions were made is quite unclear. So around 4,000 B items were loaned or gifted, and a handful of those were described as Egyptian. So on screen, we've got some of the Coptic textiles, which went to the Department of Mechanical Engineering, libation vessels, hand tools, and a grinder and pallet, which went to the Physical Sciences team. If material was collected by these other departments, the function of that object seemed to determine what category it was. The Coptic textiles now are in a collection about textiles. But the A material had a mixture of categories, including function and place. Perhaps these lines were drawn to ensure that the curatorial team with the most knowledge had those items in their care. But it can make searching through the catalogue quite challenging, especially for a paper like this, but it also says a lot about museum categorization at the time. Oh, sorry. Like many large collections and indeed national museums, the Science Museum already had items from Egypt. So you can see, if you're on the screen here, a couple donated by the Egyptian Exploration Society through the 1920s and 30s. There's things related to masonry, surveying, precious metals, and generally textiles and weaving as well. So perhaps those Coptic textiles don't look so strange after all. And in one case, the Science Museum purchased an item from Wellcome, pre any of the material arriving in 1977. This was a purchase made in 1964, and it's a plaster cast of the Denendra zodiac ceiling, the originals at the Louvre Museum, and this actually now sits in our astronomy collection. Again, it's an example of Wellcome creating casts and replicas, but quite why this part of the collection was sold in 1964, again, remains unseen. So the arrival of Sir Henry Wellcome's museum's collection led to the first two permanent galleries focusing on the history of medicine at the Science Museum. Some of you may be familiar with these, others not so. They opened in 1980 and 1981, and it meant a whole new space at the Science Museum, and it often felt like a museum within a museum. Glimpses of medical history looked at the interactions between patients and practitioners in a range of settings, and it goes back as far as a Neolithic person having a hole drilled in their skull, so having open heart surgery in the 1980s. Some were really tiny dioramas or large room sets that you can see on the slide here. The other, Science and the Art of Medicine, was a chronological display of a whopping 537 display cases, which took the visitor, if they walked the right way round, from ancient Mesopotamia to the latest high-tech of the early 1980s. Equal weighting was given to pre-1800 and post-1800, and once the visitor was firmly in the 19th century, it became a history of medical specialisms, with some targeted displays looking at things like war or public health. And to borrow Tim Boone's words, who's now head of research at the Science Museum, these galleries were driven by a historic narrative, rather than focus on the collections now in their care. Arguably, though, this chronological narrative is one that the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum had used themselves, with some spaces arranged on a chronological basis, prehistoric Egyptian, or thematically including war and public health. So here's the role that those Egyptology collections played. They had their own section, Section D, where around 150 objects were displayed. Again, there are replica copies, casts. You can see some of the amulets, as well as the kind of coal pots and kind of personal grooming items. In the background of one of the images, you can see one of the mummified people that we have in the collection that we care for, surrounded by the plaster casts, which not only showed them to their full extent, but also created this idea of an atmosphere of what someone discovering a mummified human might have actually found. Panels gave information about the ideas, as well as locating people in time and space. But I have a real question about what these items were doing there, because the guidebook to these galleries says that the gallery was supposed to emphasise the importance of the scientific basis of modern medicine, and also the skill in the practitioner of applying it. So what does this mean for the Egyptology collections in this context? Is it showing that we've had a long history of human intervention in health, well-being, and in this case, death? Is it part of the chronological narrative that was prevalent in the history of medicine at the time? Was it an expected part of the display? And unfortunately, these again, I'm sorry, more questions than answers at this point. So these collections remained on display for 35 years, and occasionally Egyptian material found itself elsewhere within the museum. It was in display on our Challenge of Materials gallery, which is now closed. There was the occasional loan out to interested museums, and also for research, so some of our mummified remains have also been scanned. In the newest incarnations of our medicine galleries, which opened in 2019, called Medicine, the Wellcome Galleries, the chronological approach has now been replaced by a thematic one. So it very much takes its cue from the collection, people's stories and experience of medicine, and contemporary and historic issues. As such, very little of the Egyptian material has been returned to display. Two of the canopic jars are displayed in our Exploring Medicine gallery, which is a 3-metre-high lift wrap, giving a snapshot into the variety of Henry Wellcome's collecting, mixed in with acquisitions made by the Science Museum. Organised much like our own stores, this is deliberately light in interpretation, but with visual clues. So feeding bottles might have a contemporary example in there to help people out. Pre-COVID, large print books did help people dive further, but these have now been replaced. Our second kind of Egyptian material is in the tabletop display in our gallery called Faith, Hope and Fear, which explores our emotional connection with medicine and across time and place. So this collection really hasn't been added to since its arrival at the Science Museum. Collecting priorities in the 1980s and 1990s focused on adding contemporary material of medical and scientific technologies, particularly considering when Wellcome died in 1936, there's a huge gap sometimes. So there's elements that aren't represented at all, such as transplant surgeries. The contemporary collecting was also one of the issues that Wellcome had when they were thinking about the future of their own collections. There was also a social history approach to collecting. So Greenaway's wish that I said at the beginning has permeated collecting of medical and science and technology curators alike. And from hearing from many of the speakers at this conference, there are far more people more qualified than I to determine what additions, if any, should be made. So you remember at the start of the presentation I said I'd be calling for help. For the second time in the collection's life, it's being looked at again, item by item, as well as unravelling some long-time mysteries. With Blythe House, our current object store, no longer being available, a huge project is underway to move around 300,000 items, including Sir Henry Wellcome's museum collection, to a new building at the Science Museum Group's National Collection Centre in Wiltshire that you can see on the screen now. And you can see just how massive it really is. As part of the project, there is a huge workflow. Every item is checked for hazards, it's checked for a condition, and if needed, conservation will step in to help the objects that need it most. Each item is photographed and receives its own barcode to help with location tracking and hopefully to reduce human error in the future. It also means that for the first time, lots of our items can actually be seen. For many of them, they haven't been on display, and particularly since the first medicine galleries closed, some of the Egyptology collections have not been seen. It also means that while access is limited to the move, and with ongoing COVID restrictions, there is a way for people to find out about Sir Henry Wellcome's historic collection, but also the Egyptology collections. So if anyone has any information that they could share with me, please do let me know. There is a email address on the screen and a web link. Part of the reason perhaps though, that this aspect of Sir Henry Wellcome's museum collection has been understudied is that its existence simply hasn't been known. I remember taking people around on tours to Blythe House, and you open the door to the room that contains these items and they're not quite sure. They're surprised that it's even there. And it's why I'm incredibly grateful for this event, which is bringing us together. Well, I already had this great moment yesterday where we all had bits of Winifred Blackman's collections, which was a really great moment. So I'm hoping that you'll all take a look at our collections website to see what we care for. And of course, I've ended up with more answers than questions. What definitions of medicine and science were applied to the transfer? Who determined what department would care for it? And what sense can we make of the Egyptology collections in our care within this larger Wellcome collection as well? So to my mind, this is an area that is ripe for research and is an untapped resource. So hopefully many collaborations will come from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Selina. That was fantastic. And I've learnt a huge amount as well, and considering how much we collaborate anyway over the Science Museum collections, just shows how much more there is to find out about them. I've had a couple of questions already, but I'm sure some more will come in. But I'll ask the ones that are here already. The first one actually would be interesting to get a selection of people answering. I think it's actually about the practice of museum, what's known as marking and labelling, and asking if it's okay to write numbers by pen on objects. They're actually painted on, aren't they, on the objects on the Science Museum. And I don't know how practice in the past compares to current practice at the Science Museum, for instance.
So in the past, I know there's, I forget the name of it, and there is it's like a layer is put on top of the object before you write. So there's a way of protecting the object underneath, so you're not writing directly onto the surface. Yes, Isabel, thank you, Astone. So there are lots of different ways of doing it. Personally, it's not something I've ever done. I unfortunately don't have the manual dexterity to do so. For paper items, we use pencil. Because it's easily removed. But I think there's kind of new ways of, so everything that went on display in the medicine galleries was number painted to conservations. I hope there's a conservator in this audience somewhere to help answer this question. But also the barcodes are tied on, so there's no kind of permanent barcode on them, so they're made to be easily removable as well. So it's just another way, another numbering system to add to the myriad of the ones that we have. But if any conservators are out there, please help me out with the answer.
Thank you. And a second question from Bella, actually, about Jebel Moya material, which again could probably be put to several of the presenters today and yesterday. Just an appeal really about, is there any more information about material from Jebel Moya, and would it be possible to connect post-conference? I know, Selina, you've put your contact details on the slides.
Yeah, so definitely. I did have I think it was a PhD student who was looking at Jebel Moya. So I have a list of everything in the collections and a link, so I can send that on to you, Isabella. I think it's really interesting how fragmented bits of the Wellcome collection are. So you think you have everything, like, oh great, I've got the Blackman collection, and then you suddenly find out you haven't got it all. And I think that's the really interesting thing about it. And I can imagine that from, you know, the people doing the transfer, that must have been really hard. So I think I'm very interested in the people behind the transfer as well as the skills they had, to find out a little bit more. Ken has put an amazing answer to the numbering in the chat. Thank you, Ken. So yes, I think it's interesting. I feel a lot more confident in the fact that I now know I could email quite a lot of people and be like, do you have this? Or even if you don't know, if you do. And I know we've talked a lot about, you know, record keeping and the interesting nature of some of them as well.
And I do think there's a whole other project once we finish with the museum transcription project, which is around Wellcome's interest in archaeology, which some of those items were given museum numbers in Wellcome's own museum, but a large majority of them weren't. And that's a discussion I've had with Rachel at Durham, where they have a lot of the archaeological material. And clearly there were some coherent numbering systems at one point in time. It's just a question of trying to reconstruct them. Just a question, she says dismissively, as if this was really easy to do. It's really complicated to do. I think we may have one more question that's come in. Just again from Bella saying she will contact the Petrie Museum as well.